Hmm? Amanta? I think we're having a bit of a problem, talking to Abhinandan at this point of time. I don't know if he's able to hear us, but let's get one of our other panelists online here. And this is Amanta Pereira, who's joining us from Sri Lanka. And this is one of the beauties of a conversation like this. You must expect some trouble in conversation sometimes, but that's how it is. But this is the beauty of this wonderful world where when somebody from Delhi fails us, somebody from Sri Lanka can chip in. And so we have Amanta Pereira joining us, and it's great to see you, Amanta, on this wonderful morning. And Amanta, of course, is a writer. He's been in various locations in Asia and the Pacific. But most importantly,
he's covered the
civil wars in Sri Lanka. But most importantly, Amanta is also doing work with what's called the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is a center which is set up essentially by an American doctor who coined the term Stockholm Syndrome. And this DART Center for Journalism and Trauma was essentially started for journalists who have to cover conflicts, who have to cover wars and calamities, and basically to kind of get journalists attuned to the demands of covering crisis situations, which might eventually affect them in their mind. When Amanta is also doing work on the impact of press freedom due to the online threats that have been all over the place in various many countries. Threats like trolling, threats like doxing, and threats like DDoS, dedicated denial of service, which seems to be one of the practices that's all over the place. So I think Amanta, this is a good place to start. Because Sri Lanka itself has had a fair few social media outrages in the last couple of years. There has been an occasion in just the last year when Sri Lanka had to shut down Facebook because of the kind of role it was playing and so on. But before we get into all that, why don't you just make a little presentation on what you think is something that you need to front page at this point?
Well, I would like to bring attention to what you just mentioned, the trauma impact of online journalism. As Faith spoke a little while earlier, now every journalist is working online, whether he or she is not doing the work for online outlets. The work is being done online, and what we are seeing increasingly is that the online work of journalists has a very high trauma threat. And this is not only when it comes to journalists, editors who are dealing with graphic content. For example, if we take what happened in New Zealand last month, such graphic content could be in the desks and on the computers of journalists, photo editors, even page designers. And they go through this over and over and over again, and there's an impact of that. But also, there are lots of journalists who are primarily writers or researchers who just plow into online resources to gain information. And they face a lot of threats. Sometimes these threats are directed, like what you mentioned, like threats, trolling, doxing, all that. But sometimes they're not. For example, if a journalist...
I think you should explain doxing to people who haven't heard the term.
Oh, that would be your private personal information just being put out on public. Your phone numbers that you want to be kept private, somebody just puts it out, and it's on the web. But it could be somebody who is a researcher who is looking into the history of Sri Lanka's civil conflict, and that person could encounter a lot of graphic imagery, lots of graphic details. And what we have seen is that if we don't prepare journalists to deal with these kind of situations, these kind of contents, it has an impact on their work. Because trauma does have an impact on the way we think, on the way we approach our work, and we need to be aware of that. It is somewhat similar to somebody going into a hazardous zone. And physically, journalists now take a lot of precautions by way of physical safety, by way of travel, all that. But we need to extend that kind of safety to their mental well-being, and also for journalists who are working online.
So what are the resources available medical and psychological and other resources available to help in this area?
Well, I think before we go into the medical resources that are available, my line of work is to build awareness and resilience among journalists who are doing this. If we go back 5 or 6 years, even the term journalism was quite alien in Sri Lanka, even though we had come from a 30-year-old civil conflict. We had seen a lot of disturbing images and incidents. That this kind of coverage could impact journalists was quite alien. And to build that awareness, the first thing we need to do is build awareness among journalists that the fact that you're online and you're researching could lead to certain traumatic influences and trauma impact. And then before we talk about medical interventions, there are other awareness buildings that we need to do. For example, we need awareness among peers. If who is researching and come in and tell the news editor or peers working with him or her that, look, I don't think I can do this. Is there any way that we can help out? Or if you're covering a potentially traumatic story that is of a extended duration, there's a discussion going on the potential impact. And we need that kind of awareness. And beyond that, the medical interventions are when the cases get serious. For that, you need a clinician to get involved. But that's at a far serious level of impact than what I'm talking about. At such a level of impact, we wouldn't advise that person to continue in journalism, at least for a short while.
Now, going back to your experience in covering the Civil War, what kind of pressures or threats did you or your colleagues or other people you observed face from either from the government or from the insurgents, the armed militants? Although it's not related to this strictly, surely, since we are talking about media freedom, I think that would be relevant and it'd be valuable to get your insights on this.
I mean, it was a country divided, right? Almost divided physically. You could draw a line at a certain point in the country to say this is where the division takes place. And you were identified within those groups. Either you were part of that group or part of this group. And if you were identified within a part of a certain group, myself with the majority Sinhala ethnicity, if you were to do anything that was even minutely construed as being negative towards that community, you faced threats. And these threats were not only from the outside. They could be within the editorial as well. There were colleagues who would create a very unsavory situation for you because you were reporting on things and the content was not to their liking. Then there was the physical threats of traveling into these areas. And not only the war zones, there was a time that Colombo itself was a major target. We had civilian buses that were targeted by claymore mines. Now, a claymore mine is an offensive military weapon. It's not a weapon that you think about being used in an urban scenario, but we had those being used within Colombo. So there were those physical threats. And obviously, I mean, there were other issues like abductions, attacks, and other issues.
Now, you had a lot of negative press, Sri Lanka, but the positive side would be at least two things I can think of. You are now off the global impunity index that's put out by the Committee to Protect Journalists, which we take very seriously. You know, in other words, journalists get killed and justice is not rendered for a very long time. Sri Lanka, which used to be on the list, is off. Although I'm sorry to say, India is a founding and permanent member of this club of shame. It continues to be on that index year after year. So that's one positive for Sri Lanka. You're off that you're out of that club of shame. Two, you are the only country in the SAARC region, in the South Asian region, that, as far as I know, that doesn't have a law of criminal defamation, which does threaten media freedom. Would those be seen as major pluses or what?
Well, obviously, yes. I mean, if you take the situation in pre 2015 and the situation right now, at that point, 2015, I would be speaking, if I were to speak in a conversation like this, in a dialogue like this, I would be speaking under far more dangerous constraints than now. So there is a change, and that change is manifest in the way the media uh, works right now. But I would like to go back to something that Ram mentioned, that justice being done. We may not be in the impunity list, but if you look at the journalists who paid with their lives, the investigations have not proceeded in a way that we could be satisfied that they would reach a conclusion. So that then gives way to the fear. What is the guarantee that we will not recede back to where we were before 2015? I mean, just this week, we had a writer through Facebook who has been arrested by police. So there is no guarantee that the situation could recede back to where it was pre 2015. And I think that is the main concern that a lot of journalists and others who work in media and for media in Sri Lanka have right now.
Our previous conversationalist spoke about the need to have combative media, that he was actively opposed it. Do you have that in Sri Lanka? Are people reasonably united, at least the journalists and other media persons?
I think to a level that we can be satisfied, there are lots of divisions within Sri Lankan media. And those divisions could be party affiliated, those divisions could be based on political ideology, and even individual ideologies. And also don't forget that Sri Lanka still has a very large government-controlled media. Even though people tend to use this term public media, it's not public at all. It's used as an arm of government that is in office at that day. So you have this huge behemoth which keeps putting out all information and not information into the public sphere. So there is a lot of divisions that are happening and that are actually manifest in Sri Lankan media. But I have to add that there are also Sri Lankan journalists and media workers who are united and at least who want to do a proper job.
Amanta, this is Krishna Prasad. And it's great to hear what you're saying, that things have improved, and I hope it stays that way. But if I were to ask you, for the purposes of this conversation, what are the three major threats to media freedom at this point of time in the new Sri Lanka, in the more peaceful post-war Sri Lanka? What are the three or four things that come to your mind? Where are the threats coming from? And secondly, yours is a country which has also seen some really very famous killings of journalists. My question was, with these threats and with the past that is behind you, are you now able to showcase to the world the situation in Sri Lanka much better than what it was in the past because of social media and other things? Earlier you could hush up things, but is it now much more easy for you? And thirdly and finally, as a small country, how do you look to somebody like India or the United States in terms of media freedom when we are not specifically at the upper end of that freedom?
I'll go from the third, second, and the first. In terms of how do we look at India, I think we'll look at it in a way where, okay, this is what could happen in Sri Lanka. For example, there are lots of us here who are looking at the way the Indian elections are going on right now. Yes. And if you replace the parties, the situation in Sri Lanka is quite similar. And the way things are happening, it's like a larger example of, okay, this is what could happen in this country. And in terms of the way we look at media, I think that's the way we look at Indian media. And lots of the times, like even in technological innovations, people tend to take a lot of cue from India.
There seems to be a role reversal.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I'm not really sure whether the impact is positive, but still. The second question was, Krishna,
was about whether you are able to showcase media freedoms much better because of or infringements much better because of social media, and it can
Yes, yes.
broadcast it
I
to the
mean,
world much more.
obviously, if you go back to November, the last week of November, and what happened in Sri Lanka, the sacking of a prime minister and the appointment of a prime minister, a lot of the information came out into the public sphere because of social media. For example, there were lots of criticism that certain networks were only airing or giving undue percentage of their airtime to political parties and personalities that they favored. But that kind of reporting was counterbalanced by people going on Facebook. For example, there were uh, MPs and parliamentarians who would use live streaming to live stream meetings that were taking place inside the parliament. The fisticuffs that took place inside parliaments were live streamed. So and people's opinions came out. I recently looked at the memes, and I myself find the best political commentary, anything else. The ordinary man's comments on what is happening right now actually is reflected without any dilution on those. So yes,
Amanta, we could do with your moving to India for a while. Could do with importing you, because these are the things that we want to hear and that
right.
need to be done.
The first question you haven't still answered. What are the
Yeah.
three major threats you face as we speak?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to get in there. I think one of the major threats is ownership of media in this country. And when I say ownership, it's not only private ownership. We have government ownership and private ownership. And sometimes, often, what has happened is that the general public doesn't know the political affiliations of these owners. And these networks, including the government ones, have undue power to sway public opinion. And I think we need to address that. I mean, it's urgent, and sooner we do that, the better. And I think the next major threat that's facing media as a whole in this country is how social media is going to work in the future. Because we have had research instances where researchers have come up with evidence to show that there have been Twitter bot armies that have been set up that could be unleashed. They haven't been, but what would they do if at a time when public opinion matters and public opinion could be swayed by the usage of social media? I mean, I believe that social media in Sri Lanka is weaponized. And what has not happened right now, to a large extent, to a major extent, is the deployment of these weaponized social media units. And I think that's a huge threat that is facing media right now.
One last question. I mean, you are in Sri Lanka, but one of the biggest cases of doxing that has happened, or even trolling that has happened at a mass scale, is of Maria Ressa in the Philippines, of the Rappler. Do you have instances like that in Sri Lanka where the freedoms of journalists is specifically threatened by online troll armies or weaponized political parties? Do you find instances of that which are threatening media, and we need to showcase it to the world?
Not to the level of Maria's case, because Maria's case is an exceptional case, and the use of social media, Facebook, is at an exceptionally high level in the Philippines. But in Sri Lanka, I have come across instances where that has happened at a local level. For example, I met a Sri Lankan journalist who's working in a location about, say, 100 kilometers from Colombo, where he was trying to report on a story that was happening at a place of worship. And by the time he had gathered the information and he had returned home, his Facebook Messenger was already being filled with messages of hate, saying this is what we are going to do to your family, we are going to put your names out, this is what you are going to do to your wife. So there are cases, but not at that level.
This I think issue, we have to now close.
There's one last question, which is, women journalists are almost always at the receiving end of doxing. where their personal details are put out. Are women journalists in greater danger in Sri Lanka? Very quickly.
I would say yes, not only online, but also in the offline work. I would say yes.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank
This
you.
was
My
very
pleasure.
valuable, these insights, and we hope to be in touch with you again, in conversation with you on these platforms. Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much, Amanta, and do take my suggestion seriously to transfer residence to India for a while.
Yeah.
If you do.